Hello everyone, welcome back to our last set of videos here, last video on this little collection for the beginnings to set 5, our constructed metagame. While there are going to be a lot more decks than what I was able to go over here, I do believe that there's a lot I haven't discovered or I need someone else to kind of figure out for me in some ways. I can kind of build what I would expect to see or have kind of a general understanding of what we may see from the opposing side, but ultimately there are going to be some decks that kind of slip through my fingers or ones I'm not really too interested in. I believe there's some copies of, some Sapphire Emerald decks that are taken off in some kind of way, which seem a little cool. I don't know how viable they are, again, without any kind of way to homogenize a metagame and really have everyone test decks against each other too efficiently like we were able to previously with an online client. It may still be an unknown variable when it comes to the challenges. We're going to have a lot of data. And one thing to note, I will mention that's going to be very advantageous to those, or disadvantageous depending on your perspective, for those in Las Vegas as opposed to Birmingham, is that there's a 9-hour time difference. And deck lists aren't due until an hour before the tournament starts in Las Vegas, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but that's my understanding of deck lists, how they work with the submission. So we're going to get some coverage going of set 5 metagame in a challenge for Las Vegas prior to the start of the tournament. Just barely, not too much, a few hours depending on how coverage works for them over there, if it's live or there's any kind of delay or anything like that. But there's going to be a bit of data there, and the only other data point we're going to have that I would really give any kind of credit to is there's a 10K, I believe, in Atlanta at the end of August. That's going to be maybe a 200-300 person event, and any other large event like that we see in Europe as well. Those are the ones I'm going to be looking at mostly and really kind of help shape our metagame. So if you want more data, I'm going to be going over more decks I expect to see when we get closer to the event, probably the week of Las Vegas. It's kind of where I believe the metagame is at and what I'm preparing for specifically. But this is where we're at for now, and this is what we have. Diving into this one here, there's 3 decks in this video series here, and guess what? They are all amber steel colors. So if this is why you wanted to be here, you see a bunch of amber steel decks, you're in the right place. This is the right video for you. So first off, we're starting with one I actually shared online more recently. I played this this past week at my local game store. It was a lot of fun. I think I had the best win record as far as games go at the event. I think I went 3-1. I lost to the Amethyst Steel deck we actually covered in one of the previous videos that one of my friends was playing almost the exact list. I think they had a couple of copies of the Shift Bell from set 4 over the Elsa 5th Spirits that I had, but pretty much the same list from there is what I lost to. Didn't get the best draws in some of the games. I will say I drew 4 Pride Lands in the 3rd game, and it was a little bit of a hiccup there, but this deck does have a lot of explosive starts. And to start, this is another Daisy Duck deck. Daisy Duck and Pete, actually, those 2 cards together really offer a ton to help prevent your opponent from being able to interact and challenge or stop you from questing to the maximum effect. Those are some cards I think people are going to have to adapt for, and why we see, I think, a lot more copies of people playing cards like Captain Hooks, me, or even Lumiere. Lumiere is a card in Ruby that I think might see a lot of play in conjunction with Rafiki. Harkening back all the way to the first video in this series, the Ruby Amethyst deck, another way you could take that is with Lumiere and Rafiki. Just on turn 2, you're able to immediately challenge a Daisy Duck for 4, and that can be enough to really stymie an aggressive start. But back to this deck here, some of the newer cards we mentioned, again, Daisy Duck, fantastic quester, Pete, a way to help stabilize, but Doc. Doc is a card I've not fully explored yet and really haven't utilized the full potential of, I think, quite yet. 2 cost, 1/3 uninkable, sure, not the greatest. It is a May effect, so you don't have to do it. You can still just play this out as a very, pretty poor character on turn 2, but the option is available. It is a 1/3 that when you play it, you can discard your hand to draw 2. While you don't really want to be discarding your hand, and you don't need any cards in the hand to use that effect, the goal is, of course, as mentioned, to empty your hand before playing the card and have it be a 2 cost, 1/3 that draws 2 cards. And that kind of effect is extremely powerful, being able to help turbo through your deck, and one of this deck's weaknesses always was the ability to refill its hand. This deck does play copies of Whole New World. While it's not a very great game plan to be on all the time, it can come up. You don't have to use it as a primary way to win the game, but it does come up pretty often when you get to Whole New World off some of your shift targets here to then refuel and kind of keep on keeping on. But the idea, of course, is using Pride Land's static effect of having either a king or a, I believe, prince here to reduce the cost of your characters by 1. I haven't yet got the dream of having 2 Pride Lands in play and having them both attached to 2 different Prince or Kings, which are really just the 1-cost Simbas. The 1-cost Simba and the 2-cost Simba are the only Prince or Kings in this deck. They're really princes. The King, of course, being the Shift Simba, which we'll get to in a moment. But those cards, or that kind of combo Simba with Pride Lands in conjunction with Stitch Rockstar means all of your cheap characters, which there are, 16 1-cost characters, and then beyond that 16 2-cost characters, all then draw a card when you play them, and they cost less. So you can kind of play a bunch of 0-cost characters for free, and then draw cards off them to keep going and keep on going. And one of the ways you kind of take advantage of that is using Philatides or Phil. While some of the newer cards are actually not heroes, Daisy Duck, Doc, and Pete are not heroes, and neither is Smee, unfortunately, the rest of the deck pretty much is. I don't believe there's anything else in this deck that is missing. Kida, Stitch, Simba, Piglet, Simba, Rapunzel, Kida, Stitch, Simba, all heroes. So there's a good deal of heroes. While you can use that in a pinch if you're able to, with an excess amount of ink, to play Phil as well as have Rockstar Stitch going, which is quite the feat. It is hard to set up all those things, with a Simba and a Pride Land still alive as well. You get to then kind of churn through and play a bunch of cards for 0, get a bunch of lore for free off of the Phil, and then keep on going until you end any kind of cycle there with Pete. This deck was always pretty vulnerable to the fact that it could deploy a bunch of threats, and then it would end. Your opponent would either grab your swords or be prepared, and you'd be a little bit sad. Previously, I've tried versions of the deck with cards like Bare Necessities to help stop that sometimes, but it doesn't always work out. Maybe they have more than one, and a song isn't really what this deck wants. It wants more characters to help be proactive, and Pete was kind of a perfect filler there. While Pete doesn't work with Stitch, it is something to kind of help stymie any kind of retaliation against your early characters. The best start this deck can have, namely, isn't Daisy Duck. It's actually the Steel Simba, Future King. Being able to draw a discard does help when it comes to having excess copies of Homeworld or Pride Lands that you can't use, so that does come up quite often. It is something to be used sparingly. But leading on a Simba on turn 1, a turn 2 Pride Lands, and then turn 3 attaching the Pride Lands to the Simba, and then playing any number of 1-cost characters as well as a 2-cost character, like a 2-cost Simba to help protect, is really what this deck's looking to do. That's your turn 1 Simba, turn 2 Pride Lands, turn 3 play a bunch of stuff, and then turn 3 either shift plus Whole New World or empty your hand fully and then play a Dock is really the overall game plan of the deck. Rapunzel is in this deck there as another hero. I previously had a 4th copy of Phil and a 4th copy of Simba, the Shift Simba, but I wanted some more things to help in the earlier games. And mentioned previously, Daisy Duck having 4 willpower is a huge amount of willpower and hard to deal with. And also, it essentially gives you the ability to heal fully for 3 with Rapunzel. While Pride Lands can help you heal a bunch anyway with giving extra willpower to your characters that are there and making Rapunzel even better, you don't need too much extra card draw, and it can get a little clunky. A 4-cost character is not really what this deck wants to do, but it can. And it comes up often enough with Rapunzel to where having another nice lore body to play out that draws some cards. Again, one of the deck's weaknesses that Doc is helping with is its card flow. Rapunzel fills the same role, just a little bit more, sparingly, a little more clunkily, but it's still fine. We mentioned the shift targets here before. Kida, in addition to being just a hero that you play to turn on Phil, another cheap character to play out that you use with Stitch, draw a bunch of cards, Kida offers a great deal of protection against anyone who's trying to challenge your board. Without Rush, everything in play is going to be 0 strength, so while they can then brawl or Sisu anything in play, which would be a little bit annoying, it does, against a lot of decks who are trying to build up a board and use their characters to challenge, stop them from doing so and let you get ahead on lore more than once in a turn. And of course, the turn 3 shift line of just turn 1 Daisy Duck, turn 2 Daisy Kida, turn 3 shift Kida, play Whole New World is nice. Stitch to a similar fashion, it is part of your quote-unquote combo where you're playing through and playing about a bunch of cheap characters all at once. It is the character that can sing Whole New World. The Big Simba. Big Simba is a card I had 4 of. I still kind of want 4, but I need to find some way to fit the Rapunzels, and that was another card that seemed like it was, didn't have enough lore to really warrant its effect. It is very strange how similar this Simba and the Sapphire Cusco are to one another. They have pretty much the same effect of dealing with a location or an item. This one has shift, the other one has a static ability and 2 more lore. This one's uncommon, the other one's a super rare, so I'm not certain how they express rarity in this game still. It's a bit of a misnomer, a bit of confusion with some of the power level of the uncommons in this set, Pete and Simba, exclusively. But it is a very important card in this deck, and in a pinch can deal with a library, a castle, or an item that is really giving you any kind of trouble, as well as we're already playing 8 Simbas anyway because of their synergy with Pride Lands. So having a shift card in your deck can really be a surprise factor, and having more copies of cards in your deck that also help sing Whole New World is pretty important. I have shifted Simba several times in this deck, and it's something not to scoff at. I've even played it for its full cost of 6. While your goal is to empty the board or empty your hand and play to the board as quick as possible, it is always nice having 5 to 6 ink in play when you can sometimes just raw draw Whole New World and play it. I wouldn't be afraid of doing so in the mid to late game either if you're at a high lore amount, because drawing, playing a whole new world and then playing a fill, which then, you can play any number of heroes off of afterwards, gains you that burst lore to help close out a game that may be a little bit out of reach if your opponent's starting to stabilize too. But this was a ton of fun. There's a lot of play lines. You do need to be cautious with your ink. There's 16 uninkables in this deck, so always be certain keep making sure you have a number of cards in your hand that, Doc is an uninkable that you actually don't want to play early, so it's a little bit awkward. It is a card I usually will keep one of most of the time. Pride Lands, also a card you want to play on turn 2 most of the time. If you have a Simba, again, Simba, the 1-cost Steel Simba is your best card in your deck. It's a card I would never mulligan. I always want one of. And Daisy Duck is good. Uninkable you want to play on turn 1 as well, but it is often awkward when you have the 1-cost Simba, a Daisy Duck, and Pride Lands, because I actually don't want to have the Daisy Duck there. I'd much rather have other cards to play to make sure I can ink and play the Pride Lands and then set up for the turn 3 play of attaching Pride Lands to Simba and a backup plan in case that goes awry. So this deck does have some nuances to its play patterns. It may not be immediately obvious, but it is an overall very aggressive deck using Piglet, Smee, which again, another Captain Piglet here being one of Smee's best friends, to get a bunch of lore early and have a very good mid to late game plan where you get to draw a bunch of cards as well. One of the most fun decks I played in a while, something I really enjoy and I'm going to work on going forward too. But let's go on here to another deck, another Amber Steel deck. Another Amber Steel deck that's a little bit different, but using a lot of the same cards. Daisy Duck, Piglet, and Smee make their appearance again. Even Doc showing his face here. Well, there's only 3. A little bit different of a take. So Mufasa. Mufasa is a card that's been one of my favorites since I started playing it in set 2. I'm not certain. I'm going to go ahead and take credit for putting Mufasa on the map, because I know I did. I was one of the first people to play with it. It was a strong card early on, and it kind of got, a bit of a bad rap at first, not fitting into too many things. But when people are relying on cards like Lady Tremaine, it certainly, showed its worth there. And I, top 16, one of the online, the pack events with Mufasa, ended up losing to Sky on Blue Steel in a matchup I consider pretty favorable. But Mufasa is one of my favorite cards and been with me since the beginning. Back to the deck, however, we're kind of seeing this deck poured over from the previous format with some new faces. One of the biggest inclusions here, of course, is Pete and Daisy Duck. Again, a pretty much mainstay of any kind of steel Amber deck, I will say, is Daisy and Pete. They are cards that go in tandem pretty well. Daisy requiring people to challenge and people stopping people from using actions to answer your characters early, like grab your swords, really showing you how much the format may have changed. And we're going to get to some other cards that may have changed how we play this deck as well. You'll see the usual culprit, again, Piglet, Smee, and Doc to help refill your hand, where Doc may not always work out the best in this deck because you do have some more expensive cards. It's not the worst just to play out in the early turns and late game kind of recur it, which we'll get to. Magic Broom is a concession to some of the aggressive decks. Having a 2-3 for 2 is pretty relevant, and also answering Diablo, which this deck can't really otherwise do. I'm not certain how many Diablo decks are going to be played, but it is good to kind of cover your bases this early on in the format with someone who may have not wanted to adapt too much to the new set coming out and still playing what appears to be a set 4 or set 3 even deck, where Diablo was doing pretty well, of course. Gaston and Doc, being our 3-cost acceleration pieces in Amber, helping us get to our turn 6 and turn 5 plays earlier. We do have a plethora of 6-cost characters. We have 12 in general, so Gaston is almost always our best turn 3 play. And speaking of Gaston, while it doesn't have the ability to quest for very much, its ability is not a quest ability, unlike Doc. Doc needs to quest to get the cost reduction effect. Why is that important? Well, Sven. Sven is a character that readies it and says they can't challenge or quest for this turn, but you can still use Gaston to cost reduce something. While Svenning a Gaston isn't the most impactful as far as being aggressive in lore, it does make your Sven effectively cost 2. I do believe Sven is a very powerful card. It is very similar to LeFou, of course, and LeFou has a little bit more flexibility, being a cheaper card and also being able to let the character challenge again. Sven is just really a protection kind of card, where it readies your Smee so it doesn't take damage on the turn you don't want it to, against maybe a deck that's playing Grab Your Swords or the Storm Rage on. It helps protect your Daisy Ducks. It's also inkable. And in some situations where you go on to turn 4 with a Gaston that's been readied, you get to cost reduce Sven by 2, making it cost 2. Ready your Gaston and still play another 4-cost character or 4 ink worth of things. So your play could be something as crazy as turn 3 Gaston, turn 4 Sven, Smee. And that's just something you can do. You can play all those cards out, because readying the Gaston a few times is essentially reducing the cost by 2 on each of those cards more than one time. Really cool kind of play you can make there. And something I think Sven is going to be overlooked at first, but eventually kind of come into its own for this format. Rapunzel, of course, the mainstay of any kind of character-based Amber deck. Mufasa is kind of the mainstay for here. Perdita. Perdita is a card I've not typically been a big fan of. It is uninkable and it is a higher cost character. One of the things to note with this deck is Dock. We mentioned Dock being able to refill the hand late in the game and not being the best turn 2 play, but something you'll still do sometimes when you just need to play something out of your hand, and it's uninkable, so playing it's better than holding it most of the time. Late game, Perdita, if you're empty-handed or nothing really in play, you can return Dock to play and then use the effect again. So being able to kind of churn through your deck there with Perdita activations and readying Perdita with Sven, not of course by using Perdita's effect to return something cost 2 since Sven is 4, but being able to do that so you protect your Perdita from a Maui is something that I think is going to come up more often than not, or more often than you may imagine at first. Happy addition to the deck, helps you kind of recur any kind of Piglet or Dock to either grind or really get aggressive there. Hercules is something I experimented with in Blue Steel a lot at the end of last format. It is very hard for a lot of decks to deal with, and also the Bodyguard and Resist means that it doesn't die to a long game Zeus. It trades with the Maui straight up, and it's just an overall solid body. It doesn't really die to much, and if people are going to be chipping back on the copies of World's Greatest Criminal Mind, it may be even good against Amber Steel Songs in that sense, where previously their only answer was that kind of card or had to use a Storm and a Zeus to kill it. They may not have that option available to them. Speaking of cards that are pretty good against a lot of challenging base decks, one of the cards I've been most impressed with in this format is Jafar. People haven't really talked about it yet. I gave it a pretty high rating in my early set review, and I kind of stand by it. It does die to red cards, sure. It dies to Sisu, it dies to Brawl, it dies to Medusa, that's fine. I think a lot of people are playing with decks that don't have those cards, or in a lot of those instances there, had to use them earlier. I explain situations to people where they play, you get to play Gaston and then play Jafar, right? You get to Gaston into Jafar because it's a really good play where you get to then defend your Gaston because they can't use characters that cost 4 or less. And this is only turn 4, where Gaston exerted to then play Jafar. People say, well, then they can just brawl it. I'm like, you mean that they didn't brawl the Gaston then? My Gaston living is good enough kind of signal to me that they don't have a brawl more often than not, because it's a premier target to kill. And I don't know many people who are trying to kill a Gaston or a Daisy Duck with brawl more often than not. Jafar then lets you take an extremely aggressive route in this deck where you normally wouldn't get to quest with Piglets and Daisy Ducks multiple times, to where your opponent just can't challenge it. 4 or less is most of the cards in most of the decks that I've played with. I don't know many decks that have gone through that have more than maybe 10 cards at the very most in some of the most extreme situations. 10 cards in the deck that can then challenge. And with this format being way more challenge-centric than it was previously because of cards like Daisy Duck and the inability for spells to interact with it profitably, not only because it's 4 willpower, but also because of Pete existing in this format, Jafar, I think, is going to do a lot of work. And I think people are, people were sleeping on Caravel for a minute, but I still think people are still sleeping on Jafar. And it is a crazy card that can just drastically warp the game to where nothing else can challenge. We haven't even gotten to the point where if you have a bodyguard in play like our Hercules, there's no other bodyguards in the deck really, so that's not really too much of a concern. But what are they going to do? Maui this? It doesn't die. It doesn't die to Maui. There's nothing they can really do. Jafar is just an incredible card that I think people haven't really been able to fully appreciate quite yet. And there are only 3 here. I'm trying to find another room. I'm trying out Perdita right now. Previously, the Perditas were just extra copies of Hercules and Jafar, but I'm giving some chances to other cards, and I think Jafar has proven to me its worth in a lot of ways to where I wanted to make room in that ink slot to try it out. I would suggest doing so yourself. Again, against Ruby decks, I can just ink it, and I can then play my Perdita, which, sure, they could kill that too, just the same as Jafar, but that didn't stop people from playing 4 Perditas against Ruby decks. Didn't stop them. There's so many things they have to kill. They can't just always save their 3-cost answer for my 6-cost character when I'm playing to the board the entire time. So people are getting a little too hung up on the fact that it dies to removal and not enough of how the games actually play out when it's in their deck. If you ever have a question like that about how cards work in your deck, I would just put 4 of them in your deck and not think about it. Especially if it's inkable, just try it out. See when you draw it if certain situations you can play to, or it just completely changes how the landscape of the game plays. Next up here, of course, the mainstays Tinkerbell and Stitch. I wish I could have more Stitches because they're still a really great card. I think I'm shaving on them to try out Dock and see if playing them more aggressively is a bit more of what you want to do with this deck, having a lower ink cost cap, no longer playing as many Stitches. It might be right to even remove Stitch altogether, to have a bunch of Docks, and maybe Perdita being removed as well makes it so that your more expensive cards are all inkable, is ultimately where I think I would go. If you get rid of Perdita and Stitch, you can increase the count of Docks and maybe include the 4th copies of Jafar and Hercules, and then have 1 card left over to play with. But lastly on this deck, and the only card that's not a character, is Rapunzel's Tower. Another card I've been very impressed with. we've talked about how challenging it's gotten more and more difficult for a lot of decks, but Rapunzel's Tower, while being a miss for Mufasa, I think you're allowed to play about up to 5 misses and still be comfortable with Mufasa hitting most of the time. You're still in like that 90 percentile range, roughly 88, give or take. But the extra willpower from Rapunzel's Tower is massive. All the steel cards become functionally irrelevant, and being able to defend anything or make a bunch of profitable trades when you're racing to then swing the race back in your favor by removing their board and maintaining yours, Rapunzel's Tower has been incredible. You more often than not will never play it on turn 2, I should say. It is not a very good turn 2 play. It is really, really good on turn 4 and turn 5 when you have a bunch of characters to immediately move it to. I will say that's how you should use it. You should treat it more of as an action that gives your characters a temporary buff of +3, but then it turns out it's not temporary, it's permanent. There's no lore on the location, otherwise it might be the best card in the set. If this had 1 pip of lore, it'd probably be the best card in the set, honestly. It is an incredible card with 8 willpower and costing 2 to play, 1 to move, having an impact on the board as early as turn 3 if you need to. I've had many situations where I've gone Daisy Duck into Smee, and on turn 3, or I didn't have a Doc, Gaston, or anything like that to play to the board, put a Rapunzel's Tower and traded a Smee off with a Smee, and then my Smee just lived. And then I Rapunzeled it the following turn. It's a really great on that curve on turn 3 into any character you have. Be able to use that willpower to help trade, and then Rapunzel. It's a really good curve on that point. Again, only playing 3. I don't think I want to put too many non-actions in this deck, or non-characters in this deck, too many actions, so keeping it low. But I would certainly give this a try. It has been a heck of a lot of fun to play. You could make room for cards like Chernobog. I think that, again, I'm trying to play more into the Doc strategy where I don't want as many characters, or as many expensive characters in the deck, potentially removing Perdita and Stitch. But one, Chernobog, it's not going to hurt anyone, here and there. But I think it would come at the expense of Perdita just to keep the inkable count higher. Right now, this is, 7, 8, 9 inkables. Having high flexibility, 13. Having high flexibility in your deck is always something to keep in mind when you're building, to make sure that you aren't forced into plays that are suboptimal because of how your inks are working out for you. So 13 is about the max I'd want to go for this right now. You can maybe add one more 14 over something, but Perdita and Chernobog aren't really the best of friends because you take cards out of your discard pile that then make the Chernobog cost more, but I don't think Chernobog is that necessary right now, and also not very great at the exact moment, but we'll see. But we're on to our last deck here. Last deck of the series. I think we always know what I do, and I save the best for last. Steel Songs. Yeah. Give you just a minute here to take it in. If you want to pause the video, certainly can. And I'm going to start by saying there's 20 uninkables in this deck. I want to take a breather on that one because that is very high. It is about the maximum I'm willing to go for any deck, period. And it has been a challenge. And I think ultimately I will settle this deck around 18 uninkables. However, that being said, there will be 18, maybe 19 uninkables, but I will not cut a single copy of Prince Naveen. Prince Naveen is the best card in the set, maybe only second to Pete. I think Pete and Naveen are probably the best two. I think Daisy Duck's actually third behind that, in my opinion. Prince Naveen is one of the biggest tempo swings this game's ever seen. Much like, it's essentially, you have to think of it as a 4-cost, 2-lore Medusa. Really is how it plays out most of the time. Or a 4-cost, 2-lore Robin Hood that can sing immediately. It's really how it plays out most of the time. It's just an incredible card that allows you to have such crazy tempo swings to where I've had games where I've played a 1-cost character into two 1-cost characters into Ariel, and then found Whole New World, sung with the Whole New World, played Naveen, killed another character immediately after that. This deck just churns through its deck so incredibly fast, and a concept I want to kind of help people understand with how shifting works and how I think it's excusable for this deck to have the unequal count that it does, where previously it was not excusable, is traditionally we saw copies of cards like the Queen, right? The Queen was a 2-cost shifter that got to then sing Whole New World. Or we even have Robin Hood, which sings Whole New World still too, costing 3. The concept of shifting is inherent card disadvantage. You are throwing away your 1-cost character that you're putting your big one on top of to gain tempo in that way. But you're actually going down a full card. Now, if you think of that full card as a card you could have inked to then have played the Naveen, where Naveen doesn't require you to shift something on top of to get that immediate impact, similarly to how when you tap a character to play a whole new world, you now no longer have to make your character vulnerable by having it be exerted and passing with a whole new world. You get to have a readied character they cannot interact with very easily. More often than not with the queen, you would shift it, they would have a 1-cost or 2-cost character out, and then they would Mim Fox trade your queen, and then you'd still be back to parity essentially. But in these scenarios where you play Prince Naveen out, you get to play Naveen, whole new world, and then you're at parity, sure, but you still have a giant singer in play that they could not interact with unless they used a spell, an action of some kind. Naveen is, I'm going to probably say, the best card in the set. I think Pete is, it's, you know, if I had to put a point system to it, Naveen's like a 4.5 and Pete's like a 4.49. They're very close to how powerful the effects are, and Daisy Duck's probably a 4.3 or so. I think it's a little bit behind those two, but this deck's playing the 3 best cards in the set, and they're very, very scary powerful. I don't think that we've been fully power crept because they're unique effects. They're not simply replacing other cards in the game and just being strictly better copies of them. Sometimes they're a little bit better. I mean, you see 4-cost Singer 6, you know, is pretty good, but we haven't seen something like this that has this type of effect. And Pete, similarly, we haven't seen this type of effect before, so they're not power crept abilities. They're just strong cards. One thing to note, you'll see also 3 Daisy Duck. You do have to make some concessions on ink in general to the deck, and I think Daisy Duck actually collides a little bit with how this deck wants to play out its game plan, which often than not, you still want to lead on Cinderella over Daisy Duck. So I think having essentially 7 1-cost characters that make a big deal, or that are a big deal to play early is enough. You'll see, again, Piglet and Smee pop up in almost all the Amber Steel decks, I think, that are really good right now because they are such a powerful package. And one of the takeaways from these past challenges has been your ability to help close the game out in a timely manner so that the control decks have a lot to answer and also don't have a lot to stabilize a lot of time. Those 2 cards, I should say 3 cards, Daisy, Piglet, and Smee, in conjunction with a heavy lore character like Prince Naveen, I consider anything 2 lore or more as heavy lore. Those things backed up by Prince Naveen for a huge tempo weapon, as well as Pete to help lock a game out, has given this deck a whole new way to play, a whole new world of tools to work with, really. You'll still see some of the normal culprits. Rapunzel is still very strong, even better with Daisy Duck than it was prior. Robin Hood, arguably the best shift line, best steel card against steel is Robin Hood. Cinderella, primarily in the deck because I don't want to be in a situation where my opponent knows that they can ignore the 1-cost Cinderella. I want this 1-cost Cinderella to be something they have to care about at some point in the game to then give more value to my other characters that may be more important. I can't really see myself wanting to ever be in a position where my opponent knows my deck list, which does happen in top cuts of challenges, which, again, mentioning the challenges, this is, you know, my preparation for it and something I want to try out, or you get to know your opponent's deck list. In that scenario, I never want to have my opponent know that they can be okay with leaving a Cinderella in play. I want it to be threatening at all times, and that's one of the main inclusions for Cinderella. Of course, it can come up and is very good in steel mirror matches or in the mid to late game. You know, Cinderella is a fine 7-cost play. This does happen. We're a whole new world deck for what it's worth, and being able to play out a Cinderella with a ton of extra ink is something we can definitely do. So that's my main inclusion, and the reason I will probably never play the 1-cost Cinderella and not play the big Cinderella, because you just need to have that threat there and have them care. The mainstays in the deck, of course, being the aerials. Those never really left. The most powerful thing that Steel's Song can be doing is Cinderella plus Storm on turn 2. One of the reasons that aggro decks have had a struggle ever since set 2 is because of that combination of cards. Strength of Raging Fire being a premier removal spell, Along Came Zeus being great, a whole new world, and actually the outlier for me on the deck is Grab Your Swords. That's the card I'm actually still not certain on if I want to include in this deck. It is still there as a 2 of, it's kind of a holdover, but again, with the concession to wanting to have more inkable cards, it may be a card I end up cutting in favor of probably another song or 2 that I have to be inkable, whether it be another copy of Long Came Zeus or try out some different type of song to keep the song count high enough for Ariel. But Grab Your Sword, I think, not being able to kill a Daisy Duck or even a card like Smee if it's turned on with a Piglet or a Hook, all the Grab Your Sword will take care of the Piglet or Hook, won't kill the Smee. And a lot of cards in Ruby Amethyst as well are also 3 willpower. A lot of cards we're seeing in a lot of decks have basically been you have to have 3 willpower or cost 1. And our deck actually plays that same role. Everything in our deck that dies to Grab Your Sword costs 1. And some of the ones that cost 1 don't die to it in Daisy Duck. So I'm not certain Grab Your Sword is as powerful as it once was. It's a very different story when we looked at the Sapphire Steel deck prior, where we have cards like Tinkerbell to help finish it off, because 3 is a big number to hit a lot of times. Grab Your Sword plus Tinkerbell is a huge swing that usually clears most opponents' boards. So a different exception in that case. But in this deck specifically, I'm not certain if I would still include Grab Your Swords. I may experiment with other cards in that slot, hoping to increase the inkable count to 18. That's my goal, to try to play it. And you'll see here a card actually I've not included in a lot of decks prior to this, Ursula Vanessa, the 2-cost. It was kind of opened up, my eyes were a little bit opened up to how to play the card properly. And it's typically a card that's only in your deck for when you're going second, really. Not, you'll play it going first, but the reason it's in your deck is for when you're going second against other steel mirrors, where you need to have something that survives a storm in the face of a Cindy, and that you can reliably use to catch back up against other steel decks that use steel removal to kind of tempo you out of the game. They have a pretty good job of killing aerials and sometimes killing Smees, even piglets, all that stuff, pretty vulnerable. Pete is a good card actually to help swing that race back in your favor with being able to be played, prevent any kind of removal, and then Sing actually let the Storm Rage on and Strength of Raging Fire. Those cards with Pete, actually pretty good. Again, harkening back to how this deck played previously and why there's no copies of cards like Flute or Pride Lands, the Ruby decks, I think, are not as scary as they once were with this style of deck. One of the big things people always says, you had a really good matchup against Ruby Amethyst if you were playing Flutes, because they would get to a point where they would need to be prepared to board away, and then you still have Flutes going, and then you close the game out that way over the course of 2 to 3 turns. I think that's just not necessary anymore. I think Prince Naveen being a threat that can be played and, Sing either an answer or a whole new world, and the case that you can use a whole new world. One of the scariest things you could always do in the mid to late game with whole new world is play it and then play a big board, because you're going to be prepared out of the way and then lose. Ruby Amethyst is a clunky deck. It does not have the most efficient cards all the time, so its ability to challenge a lot of characters all at once from hand, not that strong. They can kill big things with Pete and Metamim Fox, which requires them to return something to hand, but they really relied on Be Prepared in that sense. And sometimes Sisu, which Sisu we may see come back a little bit more because of Pete, but the difference between 7 and 8 is a huge jump. But Pete, when you whole new world, if you leave the ability to play a Pete off of it up, you can really kind of just ice the game out immediately, especially with all the early questing you can do with Smee, Piglet, and Daisy Duck. Pete kind of helps you, essentially your closing card. You get to just play, they can't do anything, and as Pete's arms are out, my arms are out too, just saying, nope, you're done. Game's over. And Pete plus whole new world is a really scary thing to have the ability to do so, since you're consistently going to have it at the points where you need it late by being able to draw so many cards. Of course, having too many of them early is not great. I don't usually like to keep Pete in my hand for that reason. It's kind of like something like a Tamatoa from the set, the previous sets where Tamatoa is one of your best cards, so you don't have to ink them all early. But Pete is fantastic here. Prince Naveen, again, one of the big things about Prince Naveen and why I think I will never play less than 4 is in any kind of Sapphire or any kind of Steel Song mirror match, one of the big hurdles you always had to overcome with the mirror match was the fact that your opponent could leverage the fact that they got to sing with the character they have in play to use removal and then develop another character was so great that it was hard to come back from that tempo swing, where Prince Naveen gets to be a threat you develop that can sing as well as the removal spell that you were trying to play that you couldn't because you had no board in play. Prince Naveen changes the texture of the mirror match a lot, as does Pete. I think that this mirror match is no longer going to be blowouts back and forth where one person just steamrolls the other one because they had a Cinderella into an aerial shift line or anything like that. I think we're going to see a lot more back and forth. Games drag out a bit. Cards like Tinkerbell maybe creep back into this deck because they're good under Pete, and they also offer some ability to control the board outside of songs through challenging, which this deck doesn't challenge the best all the time. It can have a little bit of problem with Queen's Castle or even the library, but this deck is very much a front-footed tempo deck that wants to close the game out quickly, and we'll see how it evolves over time, maybe metagame for itself, but this is my starting point for Steel Songs, and one of the decks I've been really impressed with, and honestly, this is my tier 0. This is my best deck in the format right now. I don't know what's really better than it. I'm trying to consistently beat this deck, and I'm failing. In all honesty, I'm failing over and over again. I don't know how else to really combat it because of the aggression it can present, how it can go late against the control decks because it can just, again, Naveen plus Pete, whole new world, and present threats that it's just impossible to really deal with without the perfect answers. This deck can struggle with some of the Sapphire decks. I think an early Mufasa, like a turn 5 Mufasa, might be a bit much to come back from it, given certain things going right in the early game, like a Piglet being dealt with from the opposing side and Daisy Duck not questing for too much. But it is certainly on the radar of things to manage, and not really very many good answers other than be faster. And Naveen helps you be faster, and Pete helps you close. So really powerful deck. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video series here. This is one of my metagames that I've shown you 11 different decks to go with. They are all different, and I would say there's probably another 11 I can go through now if I could figure out what they were. But let me know in the comments what you guys think of all the different decks and what you're playing at your locals, or if you want to try any of these decks or any questions you might have, feel free to reach out. Let me know. But till next time, thanks everyone. See you all then.